Let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with this question, this idea for a second, just before you answer it. Okay, you ready? Let's just assume, and maybe this is true for you. Your church is growing, attendance is up or trending that way. The room is fuller than it has been in a long time, or maybe than ever. Maybe things are really climbing. Maybe it's growing rapidly. By every visible measure, right, things are moving in the right direction. You got it? That's the setup. Here's the question. So, why does something still feel incomplete? You ever felt that? You ever felt that the visible metrics, the church, everything's growing, attendance is growing, you're pulling out seats, you're looking for overflow, right? The kids' space is full or filling up, but it doesn't feel complete. Something feels like it's missing. If you're carrying that or any tension similar to that right now, I want you to know that that feeling is definitely not, ingratitude. It's probably discernment that you're feeling. And today, in this conversation, I want to talk about what it might be pointing at. I see this. I get to work with churches all over the world, and I see lots of stuck churches. I see a lot of kind of plateaued, churches, a lot of kind of growing. I work with some churches that are exploding, just killing it, right? So I see kind of versions of this happening in all sorts of churches. And it kind of looks like this, right? The lead pastor has done a lot of really good work. They've hired well and invested in the weekend experience, improved the teaching, given away leadership, maybe to someone like you who's helping make things better, gotten more intentional about reaching outside the walls of the church. And the room responded, right? The room has really filled up, and it should have based on all the really good work that's done. And that is real and it's important. But somewhere along the way, attendance, and maybe this begins to illuminate the gap. Along the way, attendance, it doesn't really feel like mission fulfillment. Your mission that you've written on your wall or you say every week is not to fill a room, and you know that. But it feels like that's kind of where things have shifted to. Like maybe you have felt the gap between like a growing church, here we go, and a transforming church, because those two things are not the same. Right? A full room, it is evidence of something. It's evidence of attraction. It tells you that your church is compelling, which is important. It's compelling to people in your community. Listen, that really does matter. We don't want to be unattractive for sure. And we should celebrate that our church is attracting people in the community into the building, into the house. That's important. But a full room, listen, does not tell you whether anyone inside of it is becoming more like Jesus or not. A full room doesn't tell you whether seekers, I'm going to use some terms here that if you have been around me, you know what these mean, but a seeker, a person who's far from God, it doesn't tell you if that person is becoming a believer and becoming a student of Christ and beginning to learn more about what it looks like to be a follower, whether that learner, that early Christian is beginning to shape their life. We call these people shapers, shape their life after the ways and teachings of Jesus, actively living differently because of what they have learned. It doesn't tell you whether that shaper is becoming a last category, a steward, a person who is now stewarding their life for the betterment of the kingdom and for the glory of their Heavenly Father. The number in the room just tells you how many people showed up last Sunday. And you know what we call those? We call them lag metrics. And for a lot of churches, it's really has become the primary metric, which means the primary question that the system is built to answer is how many people came? That's an attendance question. And your system will become very good at answering it and very good at bending the system to it. I mean, that's really where this gets kind of uncomfortable. And if you know me, I don't mind making us uncomfortable. I want to stick in the uncomfortableness for just a minute because I think it is really a real diagnosis. And here's something that you may have heard this before. You don't really need Jesus to fill a room. And I know that sounds blunt, but it is very true. Think about it. And you don't name anybody, but you know some people, churches that have done it this way. Like a extremely gifted communicator can fill a room. Like a polished production experience can fill a room. Free coffee and a really relevant message that feels more like a motivational speech can fill a room, right? Churches have been building audiences under the label of building disciples for decades. And then they wonder why, the culture in the church never quite forms or spiritually forms. The room is not the problem, right? Think about it. The room is not the win. The win is people moving, or we would say growing spiritually. That's the win. The win is someone walking in as a seeker, not a believer yet, and over time moving through the phases of becoming a believer, a student, and then a shaper, and eventually stewarding their life for the glory of God. That's the win. Like the win is transformation that shows up in households and marriages and the way that people give and serve and engage in their community. That's the win. And you cannot measure that with an attendance number. So what happens when the primary metric is attendance? Well, I'll tell you because I've watched it. The system builds towards that metric. Like staff priorities align around attendance. Sunday debrief conversations center on, you guessed it, attendance. Programming decisions get made in the service of attendance. And slowly, without anyone deciding it intentionally, the entire machine optimizes for getting people in the room rather than moving people through a spiritual journey. I can tell you, this isn't just something I have seen and observed. I lived this for a while. When I was leading at Woodstock City Church, in the beginning, we were an independent church, but because of our location and proximity to Alpharetta, Georgia, which is where North Point Community Church was founded, we were asked to become a campus of North Point, which was unbelievable. It was such a great opportunity, experience. I have so many great things to say, so don't hear this as a negative, but I led a part of this incorrectly, and no one made me do it. I did it. This is my fault. We had a staffing model back then. They probably still do have staffing models, but we had a staffing model back then, and rightfully so. It was built around attendance. When we were a very volunteer-heavy organization, all of our ministries were small group centered, which means that we had lots of volunteer needs because we put everybody in circles, right? From 2-year-olds all the way up through adults. And so we didn't have a lot of big rooms with a couple of adults managing it. We had lots of little rooms with lots of adults sitting in circles. And so we needed a lot of staff to lead and manage all of those volunteer needs. And so we had a staffing model that was predicated on, you guessed it, attendance. Because the more people that were there, the more staff we would need over time to manage the complexity. So I'll tell you the number because I don't know that it matters, but we had I remember in middle school ministry, I can't remember how many staff we would start with, probably 2, but we would have a lot of people there, a lot of middle schoolers on a Sunday. And once we cracked 800 middle school kids on a Sunday, and I know that number it is not lost to me. That is an insane number, okay? But once we cracked 800 middle school students, we got an extra staff member just for the complexity of that many people. Because 800 middle schoolers probably meant 2,000, 2,300 middle schoolers on the active roster. And so we had to have small group leaders to manage the roster, not just the Sunday. Again, a lot of complexity in that. I remember helping think through how to design our programming to get 15 more kids there during a month so we could average 800. And again, our goal was to hit a number because we got another staff member. The system bent to the metric, okay? Now, I was vulnerable and told you about a terrible leadership move on my end. I don't think I'm the only one who has probably felt that before, right? And that really is how the mission can drift. And it's really subtle. There was no point along the way I thought, our mission is not, our mission in middle school, or at least our statement was to help every student find a faith of their own, to own their own faith, right? We didn't want them to have the faith of their dad or their mom or their grandmom. We wanted them to own their faith. That was our mission. That was our vision. However, for a while there, breaking the 800 number accidentally, subtly became the mission, right? And that's what happens when we make that metric the thing that we're chasing, right? I mean, the calendar will stay full, volunteers will keep showing up, the program keeps running, and from the outside, it looks really healthy, especially if things are ticking up. But from the inside, the lead pastor, some of those people around that leadership circle, they start asking, why isn't Why does it feel incomplete? To go back to our original question, something isn't adding up. And that's what it is. It's that gap between what you intend and what you actually build. That's the real problem. And so, kind of here's the principle here. What you measure is always going to shape what you build towards. That's exactly how this works. It always, metrics matter. You measure what matters. But by the same token, what you measure becomes what matters. And this isn't just a business principle, right, that we're importing into church leadership. It's just a system principle. It's a life principle. I mean, show me what a church celebrates and what they track and what they report every week, and I can show you what that church is actually designed to produce. And maybe not intentionally, but accidentally. Most churches have language for transformation, right? Most are operationally wired for attraction, though. And so the language and the wiring, they're not aligned. And that misalignment is exhausting. And that may be what you are feeling. Maybe that's the gap, the complexity you're feeling. Because, the pastor is pulling towards one outcome, at least in word, but the system is working towards something else. So the move that really changes everything is luckily not that complicated. It does require, though, a very clear decision that most churches, have just not explicitly made. And here's the decision. You have to decide that attendance is a means, but not an end, right? Attendance is a means, but it is not the measure of success. Once you can say that out loud and define that, decide that, you can then build backwards from transformation, not attraction. So what would have to be true about your Sunday experience if the primary question was who is different because of today? What would have to be true about your follow-up process? There's a lot of stuff that would have to shift in these places. What your next step design, what would it look like? The way that you train volunteers, how would that change? The way that you structure your teaching, preaching calendar, what would that look like? Again, we could go on and on. There's so many more questions we could ask. And those questions, they really begin to show you the gap between what you intend and what you have actually built. The words that you say, but the thing that you're measuring that's driving the system in that direction. And you know what? Closing that gap starts with measuring the right thing. So here's what I would love for you to do. Before you run another metric dashboard report, before you present anything on, scoreboards or whatever, here's what I'd love for you to do. I want you to put a question on the table. Here it is. What evidence do we have that people who attend our church are spiritually moving, not just returning? That's the question. What evidence do we have that people who attend this church are growing spiritually, not just showing back up? I would ask your team to answer it, but with specifics. That's what evidence is. Evidence is specifics. So are there names? Are there stories? Are there patterns? Are there data? If the answer is kind of vague, attendance-based, or just missing completely, bingo, you have your diagnosis. You're probably not yet measuring what you say matters most. And you know what, from there, from there, once you kind of figure out where you are, you can now identify and just start small. One metric that tracks movement, just one metric that tracks movement. And it doesn't have to be complex. I mean, there's some very simple ones. And you may already be looking at these, but they're just, amassed in all the other things that you're measuring. So steps, baptism could be one. Maybe first step completions. A person, went from where they are and they signed up for a small group. That's a step, right? Small group starts, how many people started in a group, or went to a starting point alpha group or expressed interest in something. Those are steps. Maybe financial generosity increasing over time, especially if you can put it within different categories of people who give, don't give, tip, all the things that we've talked about before. Like, there are so many metrics that can serve as movement indicators. So just pick one. Track it, with the same rigor that you track attendance right now, and put it on the report at the top of the report, and talk about it more than you talk about anything else in your next metric debrief. Give it some weight, maybe even more weight than you've ever given any other metric. What I love about that is that kind of shift in measurement will begin to shift the design of your church. And your staff will start building towards what gets measured and what seems important on that dashboard. So your programming decisions will start reflecting a very different primary question. In fact, over time, the system will start producing a different outcome. And the goal is not to stop caring about attendance. You still want to attract people, right? We want to fill rooms because that's more people that God can change. But this is a stewardship conversation about the platform in the room and about your mission. So the goal, right? The goal is to make sure a growing room is the beginning of the mission, not evidence that the mission is accomplished. Well, let me just quickly close with this, right? If the room stays full while the culture stays shallow, you have built something that looks like help from the outside and feels like drift on the inside. And I say this all the time, the problem with drift is that it compounds. Leaders burn out trying to sustain attendance momentum without transformation payoff. Volunteers lose conviction because they cannot see what they're actually building. Long-term attenders disengage because, belonging never became becoming. The room will not tell you any of this. The numbers rarely tell you things like this. Your church, though, your church may be growing. The question worth asking is whether your people are growing, because those are very different questions. And the one you're actually asking determines the system that you will actually build. So let's start by measuring the right one thing and then allow the design to follow.